Now I'm going to start the, excuse me. Okay, have you got the screen?
Yeah.
Cool. So a nice straightforward one to work into after the Easter break. Rule 18, which is responsibilities between vessels. It's a fairly straightforward rule, but I'm going to use it to revise a little bit of definitions and talk about how we recognise or might recognise different vessels when we're at sea. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Happy days. Too many. Next slide. So, except in narrow channels, traffic separation schemes, and when overtaking, a power-driven vessel must give way to a vessel not under command, a vessel restricting ability to manoeuvre, a vessel engaged in fishing, and a sailing vessel. So, I like to talk about that as a power-driven vessel is the least privileged of all the vessels. Does that make sense? It has to give way to everything.
Mm-hmm.
A sailing vessel is the next least privileged, so they have to give way to a vessel not under command, a vessel restricting ability to manoeuvre, and a vessel engaged in fishing. And this is beginning to make sense, isn't it? So a power-driven vessel has engines, it can manoeuvre pretty freely, it can drive into the wind, it can, but a sailing vessel is much more restricted in their ability to manoeuvre. And a vessel not under command, even more so. A vessel restricting ability to manoeuvre or a vessel engaged in fishing, less able to manoeuvre than a sailing vessel. And then a fishing vessel is, when underway, shall keep out of the way of a vessel not under command or a vessel restricting ability to manoeuvre. And any vessel other than a vessel not under command or a vessel restricting ability to manoeuvre shall, if possible, not impede the safe passage of a vessel constrained by her draft. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, power-driven vessel, sailing vessel, fishing vessel, restricting ability to manoeuvre, and then not under command. And then, ideally, we should always try and keep out of the way of a vessel constrained by draft. Make sense? Mm-hmm. It kind of clarifies and puts into common sense what you would think.
Can you just remind me what is a vessel not under command?
We are going to do that. So we're going to go through all of those in a minute in detail. So the exception, well, not the exception. So strictly, the rule says that a power-driven vessel shall keep out of the way of a sailing vessel. We've talked about traffic lanes and not traffic lanes, but shipping lanes. So where it would be, I would say, normal practice for a sailing vessel to more or less keep out of the way of power-driven vessels. And I'm talking about power-driven vessels in terms of a container vessel or a large merchantman, because, you know, 36-foot yacht is just so much more manoeuvrable than 250-meter container vessel. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So I think you should be prepared to cede your rights to an extent if you're a sailing vessel. Tom talked about on Thursday when a stand-on vessel can take action, and I think a sailing vessel would be well placed to take early and substantial action to indicate that it's keeping out of the way of a power-driven vessel when it's in the shipping lanes or something like that, just as good seamanship and good practice. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
What would you consider a vessel having restricted in her ability to manoeuvre versus constrained by draft?
Well, so let's talk about that when we get to talk about what is a vessel restricting her ability to manoeuvre. Does that make sense?
Maybe a towing vessel or something like that.
There's a whole list of things that can be restricting ability to manoeuvre, and it kind of comes down to common sense, and we'll talk about how it works in practice. Happy days?
Mm-hmm. I've got a question, please, Mike.
Go on then.
On the previous chart, it seems from the point just one up from the bottom, the one about draft, constrained by draft, that seems to give. I'm not asking what draft is because you're coming to that. What the other thing is because you're coming to that. But that seems to give us a top status to the vessel constrained by draft. And just surprised me that it said that rather than, for example, vessel not under command or restricted in manoeuvrability. I didn't see why draft kind of seems to come top there.
No, so what it's actually doing, it's saying any vessel other than a vessel not under command or a vessel restricted ability to manoeuvre shall, if possible,
yes,
not impede. So
sorry, I misread it. So fine, thanks.
So you wouldn't get in the way of a vessel, to be honest, it rarely comes up in practice because a vessel constrained by draft is normally operating in a narrow channel as well. Does that make sense? So the narrow channel rule would supersede what we're talking about here. So you've already been told not to impede a vessel which can only safely navigate in a narrow channel.
Thanks.
But there are some cases where a vessel might be constrained by draft in not operating in a narrow channel. If you can imagine somewhere where a big open area of sea which is shallow but not narrow.
Yeah, thanks.
And I think I talked about it when we talked about narrow channel. The reason why constrained by draft vessels have special status is because there's something called squat, which is where as they maneuver or accelerate or decelerate, the pressure forces cause the hull to drop or parts of the hull to drop, and they can run aground and damage themselves quite easily. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so power-driven vessel, the least privileged vessel is any vessel propelled by machinery, which we discussed several weeks ago, also includes vessels under oars. Happy? And a sailing vessel which has got her engine running and engaged, and she would be displaying a cone apex downwards to indicate that she is a sailing vessel with propelling machinery engaged. Happy days?
Mm-hmm.
A sailing vessel means any vessel under sail, provided the propelling machinery, if fitted, is not being used. So as soon as we engage and start our engine, we are stop being a sailing vessel and become a power-driven vessel within the meaning of the rules. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
A vessel engaged in fishing means a vessel fishing with net lines.
Mike,
yeah, go on.
just before you go on there, so just clarification, is it when you have your engine running or when it's actually engaged in gear?
It's engaged.
Okay, thank you.
A vessel engaged in fishing means any vessel fishing with nets, lines, trawls, or fishing apparatus which restricts the manoeuvrability. But does not include a vessel fishing with trolling lines or fishing apparatus which do not restrict manoeuvrability. So a fishing vessel, just because it's catching fish, or a vessel just because it's catching fish, isn't a fishing vessel within the terms of the rules. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what we would normally, when we have a trolling line, is a reel, normally on a rod, which you trail the line behind you. Specifically, it says that does not make you a fishing vessel. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Seaplane, any aircraft designed to manoeuvre on water, they are the least privileged vessel, actually, including wing and ground craft. We don't really see them very much in the UK. But again, there's a seaplane, when it's landing, is pretty unmovable. And as soon as it's landing, it becomes a power-driven vessel. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think. A vessel restricting ability to manoeuvre means a vessel which, from the nature of her work, is restricting ability to manoeuvre as required by the rules and therefore unable to keep out of the way of another vessel. So examples would be, and these are laid down in the rules, of like laying, servicing, or picking up a navigational marked submarine, a cable, or pipeline. Does that make? I think I showed you a picture of a cable layer a couple of days ago.
Mm-hmm.
Dredging, surveying, or other underwater operations. Replenishment or transferring a person's provisions of cargo while underway. just beware, you can do that by helicopter as well, so it's not necessarily always obvious, and that still counts as replenishment. A vessel engaged in the recovery or launching of aircraft, a vessel engaged in mine clearance operations, or a vessel towing. And it says that it would include those, but not be restricted to. So, and it's something, because of what you are doing, means you're less able to manoeuvre as you normally would. So, in layman's terms, if you're pushing a shopping trolley, you're much less manoeuvrable than you are if you're just a normal pedestrian. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the practicalities is that if you're towing or surveying or doing some other kind of work, you've normally got gear or something you've got to recover before you can become manoeuvrable. So it makes sense that other vessels would keep out of your way, just because it's going to take some time, even if you wish to get into a position where you can manoeuvre freely.
Yeah.
And then finally, a vessel not under command is a vessel which, through some exceptional circumstances, is unable to manoeuvre as required by the rules. So this is something that's happened to the boat. So even if it wished to, unlike a vessel restricting ability to manoeuvre, so a vessel with divers down would be restricting ability to manoeuvre, and it could recover the divers and then it could manoeuvre. A vessel not under command means that it's lost its power or its steerage, or even if it wished to, it's not able to manoeuvre as required by the rules. Albeit it could fix the problem. If it's lost an engine, the engineers could eventually fix it, and it stops being under command. But you don't necessarily have a time to repair. So everyone has to keep out of the way of a vessel not under command.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And constrained by draft means a vessel which, because of her draft in relation to the available depth and width of navigable water, is restricted from her ability to deviate from the course she is following. Mm-hmm. So if we remember, going back to right back to the beginning, we have power driven vessel, least privilege, sailing vessel, fishing vessel, restricted ability to manoeuvre or not under command. And then constrained by draft's got her own special characteristics, which, where possible, you should keep out of the way of a vessel which is constrained by draft and not impede it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
A nice, easy one to get back into the flow, and then restricting ability and the restricted visibility tomorrow. Any questions or any bits and pieces which popped up over the weekend, or thoughts that you've had about the stuff we've done previously?
No, that's great. Thank you.
All good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Excellent. Nice.
Towards the end of the week or early next week, we're going to. I'm just going to stop recording.